Hey, everybody, this is the second lecture on the Great Depression, and I'm going to focus on the question what caused the great stock market crash. So, you'll recall that right after the Gilded Age, there was the Progressive Reform era, and it was a time where individuals and groups of people came together and they passed legislation to protect consumers. So, by the late 1920s, we only have a small number of companies that are controlling the market. And so the progressive legislation that was worked really hard on during the 1920s, a lot of it was overturned. And so you don't have the government looking out for the small guy anymore. Unemployment was still fairly high. Some companies actually grew too fast. And also, farmers were struggling and farm prices were falling. So in 1921, you have a percentage of 25% of the national income belonged to farmers. So they were doing pretty well. By the end of the decade, it was 9% of the national income belonged to farmers. And so they really began to struggle. And this was a huge reason why the stock market crashed. There was also a growing gap between the rich and the poor. So the poor were getting poorer and the rich were getting richer. And 75% of the income growth belonged to the top 1% of Americans. And so another number for you is 24,000 controlled nearly half of all wealth in the United States of America. So more and more goods were being produced in addition. And there was a surplus of things, but people just could not afford it. They could not afford to actually buy the items that were being produced because of this wealth gap. So there was also an increase of wealth, um, especially in the rural and urban areas. People during the Industrial Revolution were moving into larger cities and they were finding factory jobs. And so there was an increasing gap between the education levels and the income levels of those that lived in rural areas and those that lived in urban areas. Um, in addition, people were starting to play the stock market. They were gambling on loans and they were not doing so very wisely. And so that did have a large part to do with the stock market crash, is just poor investments by individuals. So after the initial crash in 1930, President Hoover signed in this Smoot-Hartley tariff, which it increased tariffs to Europe. Europe couldn't afford the tariffs, and so trade between the United States and Europe decreased. And so we weren't selling our stuff to them anymore, and so that impacted our overall national income. The Federal Reserve tightened credit, which, looking back, hindsight's 2020, that was a poor move, and that the Federal Reserve now in the future is always going to loosen credit so that people have an easier time getting loans. But regardless, around the Great Depression, they tightened credit, and people had a really difficult time getting loans to cover their losses, especially farmers. And so people started using their savings instead of getting loans from banks and the government. So people then, because they needed to pay for these things, they started pulling money out of their banks. And eventually they stopped trusting their banks. So people started keeping money in shoe boxes, under mattresses. They were digging holes in the backyard, burying their money. And because people were starting to pull their money out of banks, banks started to collapse. And during this entire time, farm prices are continuing to drop. So we have now a situation where the United States is falling apart. And the great stock market crash happened October 29th, 1929. And everything after that is completely different for the United States of America. The next lecture will be on the Dust Bowl.